Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you for observing the silence with us. I'd appreciate everybody coming on board quite early. We've got a good turnout today, and I'd like to introduce Site Technology and myself, Russell Cook, and Sharp. We were founded in '93, and our sort of total go-to-market, shall we say, is looking after data. And that comes in various disguises. People are moving into the cloud, but we still look after data, and it's all around how we do that. So a lot of it is technology. We can't get away from that. A lot of it is staff training and policies. What we've seen is a real move with the new upcoming GDPR around how do we handle the data in the future when we have to identify information that is personal, identifiable to an individual, and how we take that into consideration from a business perspective. So I'm immediately going to hand over to Sharp Daddy, who is our principal privacy practitioner, who's going to go through some details around what it is and what it means to companies and businesses.
Thank you, Russell. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. Throughout the webinar today, please feel free to ask questions as we go through. The more interactive, the better. So if we can get some questions, try not to make them too difficult for me, but it'd be appreciated. That'd be great. So obviously, we have 365 days until we need to be compliant to the General Data Protection Regulation. And when you break it down in days, it sounds not a lot, really. So maybe a few organisations out there will be missing out on bank holidays and weekends, but let's see. So as we move forward, some of the elements to consider will be how data is being used and how privacy is interpreted by your clients, which is quite pertinent as we see what's happening in the market, both commercially and indeed, very recently, how governments and society are looking at the use and sharing of data. But today, what I was hoping to go through is some of the actual practicality and the real questions that we will be asked out there by our clients. So we go through some of this. Consent. Consent is one of the lawful reasons for processing data. So it's not the only reason. There are 6 reasons for processing data, but consent is certainly one of them. And recently on the survey carried out by the International Association of Privacy Professionals, this was ranked as number 4 of the main concerns. And if we look at it, it's for higher standards and records for auditing consent. So this has changed around, it needs to be unambiguous, it needs to be freely given, it needs to be specific, and it needs to be time sensitive. So if you've obtained consent and then you want to change what you're using that consent for, you need to be able to demonstrate that back to your client. So a lot of organisations are now going back and asking for reconsent because of the higher standards that's required. And an example of that is what we've just seen from a client is when they went back to ask for consent from their current database, they lost 80% of that database. So that's obviously going to have a commercial impact to your business. You can argue, and it is a valid argument, that the 20% that have now given consent for direct marketing are probably interested in what you've got to say. So that's an upside to that. What I would say is, obviously, when you're going back for reconsent on your databases, on your client base, there's mandatory information that you need to be able to give your client about what you are using their data for, but also more importantly, it's how you word that and it's how you get that across to your client. So if it's too bland, if it's too legal, if it's too mundane, then people aren't going to read it. So you're going to get a lot of drop-off on that. So think about what you need to include in your consent notice when you go to get re-consent, or you're asking for consent from new clients. But also think about the terminology and the engagement process you're going to do in order to at least get them to read the notice. You probably started seeing a lot coming through from Google and other companies that will ask you to read consent in order to use their services. Again, as I said in the beginning, it's one of the lawful reasons for processing data, but it's not the only one. Under the regulation, there are 6 reasons. I won't go into all of them, but some of them are around vital interest of the individual. So if you're emergency services, then you can use personal information because probably the individual might not be in a position to be able to give that consent. Normally what we see in the commercial world, we either rely on consent, contractual necessity, so you need the information in order to enter into a legal contract, or legitimate interest of your organisation. Interestingly enough, the survey I referenced earlier, this is number 2 in terms of the main concerns of privacy professionals insofar as what constitutes legitimate interest. Now, if you are going to rely on legitimate interest for processing of personal information, bear in mind that it's not a silver bullet. It doesn't get you out of jail. You still need to be able to explain to your client base exactly what their rights are, what your obligations are, and what you're doing in order to meet those obligations. And that's normally through the mechanism of a fair processing notice, or as you may commonly have, you'll see on websites, maybe your own, a privacy notice. And there are clear mandatory elements that need to be included on that. Just as a quick takeaway, it can't be part of your terms and conditions, and it can't be tied into your cookie policy as well. They have to be separate. Data portability. So this is a new right under the regulation, excuse me, and it gives the individual the right to move data that you are holding on them to somebody else, to another organisation. So let's start asking ourselves what constitutes personal information, because they may not just be asking you to transfer their name, address, telephone number, because there's probably not a lot of value in just transferring that. However, if you have used their personal information in a report, in some form of analysis, some type of profiling, that constitutes their personal information. So if somebody says, I want you to move that personal information over to another organisation, think about what actually it is you are obliged to transfer. And when does the legal obligation end? Does your legal obligation under the General Data Protection Regulation end once the transfer has taken place? And does the organisation that's receiving the information need to accept all that information? So these are some of the points you need to clarify and have a think about. If your legal obligation is still intact post-transfer, think about how you're going to manage, the storage and everything else you need to do in order to be compliant to regulation around that data. So certainly something to bear in mind there. And again, as I've just referred to, can you actually do that? One, do you have the technology to comply to that transfer? And do you have the procedures? Do you have the verification mechanisms in order to verify that the request is genuine and that the data has been transferred effectively? So just start at least having that on your horizon if you feel that's going to be an impact to your business. Now, this is actually number 2 of the top concerns of privacy professionals, the right to be forgotten. It is a new right under the GDPR. Now, it's it is something that you have to oblige to within a reasonable period. And if you do get a request for deletion of data by an individual, can you prove that? Can you audit that deletion, and can you actually demonstrate, A, to the individual or to a regulatory authority, that the information has genuinely been deleted and not just suppressed? So that's some challenges there from backups. If you're using data processors or organisations that store and back up your data, how can they help you in that? And that's a theme I'm going to come on to in a moment and sort of get under the covers of, really. Do you use tape backup? Think about, how you're going to delete information off of tape. Definitely going to be a challenge there. Again, on the right to be forgotten, if you have made information public, then you are under an obligation to undertake best efforts to delete the information you have made public. So you might think, well, okay, that probably applies to the likes of, I'm not picking on anyone here, say Twitter or Facebook. But if you use blog content from individuals or recommendations from individuals that you have made public on those social media sites and or your own website, start thinking about how you're going to do that. So you may want to change your strategy to negate that possibility if you feel it's a risk, or you might want to start thinking about how we're going to get those procedures in place to deal with that. So common requirements, different meanings. So the regulation is a comprehensive regulation, and what I mean by that is it covers all personal data, all personal information. It's not a verticalized thing, so it's not as though, I fall out of this regulation because I'm governed by the FCA. No, you have to comply to this regulation regardless of the fact that you are perhaps regulated by PCI or FCA or other statutory or mandatory regulations. So think about how it's going to affect different parts of your business, because although it's one regulation, it does affect different parts of a business. So cooperation with the Data Protection Authority. So just a question to ask yourself. Here in the UK, we are governed by the Information Commissioner Officer, and they are, I would say, one of the better data protection authorities within the EU, because they are well resourced, and they are certainly pushing, a lot of content out there to help organisations. But if you did get a knock on the door and you were asked for an audit, how comfortable would you be? Would you feel that you could answer their questions and, more importantly, demonstrate that you have met those regulations? Something to consider. Under regulation, we have what is known as a one-stop shop. So what does that mean? That means regardless of where you are based as a citizen, if you want to raise a complaint to a data protection authority in your own country, let's say you're in Spain, about a UK company, you can do. You don't have to raise it to the UK Data Protection Authority. It is down to that country to liaise with that Data Protection Authority. Now bear in mind that there is a system and a mechanism for controlling this, and I won't go into that now. So you will more than likely be dealing with the UK Information Commissioner Officer. However, you could potentially be dealing with a Spanish, German, or French Data Protection Authority if your service or goods you are supplying into those countries, and you are obliged to be able to communicate with them in their own language. So something definitely worth bearing in mind. And is your insurance adequate for class actions? Under the regulation, if you have breached the General Data Protection Regulation and the breach affects multiple individuals, those individuals or an individual, as long as they can get enough of the take-up of the total amount of individuals affected, can now bring class actions. So, of course, the liability of the risk has gone up exponentially there. So it could be worth looking at your insurance cover to make sure it's adequate. Mandatory data protection officer. Again, something that perhaps causes a little bit of confusion. And we are getting now good clarification from the EU on what this means. So am I obliged to appoint a data protection officer? Well, if you are a public authority, yes, absolutely. If you deal in large amounts of special categories of data, processing of that data, yes, you are obliged to appoint a data protection officer. And also, if you are monitoring, so it's not necessarily just processing the data on the individual's behalf, but more if you are monitoring. So if you're involved in any sort of profiling or analytical work, then you will be required to appoint a data protection officer. Interestingly, review is coming that by large amounts of data, and there's no specific requirement in terms of the number of records or the amount of data. The view is if it is core to your business function, so if processing data systematically and is core to your business, then that now constitutes a large amount of data. And if you do need to appoint a data protection officer, what's their status within the organisation? Well, they have direct access to the highest level within the organisation. They have increased statutory employment rights insofar as if they are designated as a data protection officer and you choose to designate one, not because you're mandated to, but because you feel it's a necessity, and I would suggest it is certainly something worth looking at doing, then bear in mind that their employment rights are elevated in terms of their position because they are acting as part of the data protection authority within your organisation. And that's part of their responsibility. So their responsibilities are to help deal with risk assessments, their responsibility is to deal with inquiries from individuals, to liaise and cooperate with the data protection authorities. So if we look at what's in Germany, for example, this is a model they are very used to. They have data protection officers within organisations which pick up some of the function of the data protection authority. So that DPO is doing some of their function. So there is a bit of a, not necessarily a duality there or conflict of interest because they are employed by you, but they are picking up some of that work. Privacy impact assessments. So when should these be performed? So they are now mandatory, and they are mandatory insofar as if the type of processing you are undertaking has a high impact to the rights and freedoms of the individuals, then you need to carry out a data privacy impact assessment. So I guess the question is, what constitutes a high impact to an individual? Again, we have data protection authorities within Europe that have different views. And they will be giving guidance on the type of processing that constitutes a rule, would trigger the need for a data privacy impact assessment. But bear in mind, there is this consistency mechanism, which means if a view of the UK Data Protection Authority is we're setting the level of what we consider processing to have a high impact on an individual here, and the Spanish or Italian Data Protection Authority mark it up here and say, no, that's far too low, then it has to be agreed by consensus that there is a one-stop shop standard on what constitutes a high impact. My personal advice, think about it in a way that you would cover most benefits of doing a data privacy impact assessment, and then you're covered. So what needs to be included? So it needs to include the type of processing, who has access to that information, what is the potential impact to the individual what that processing would undertake, and what you are doing to mitigate that impact as well. Is the risk acceptable, and do you need to perhaps not continue with that data processing, or what mitigation can you do in terms of mitigating the effect of the individual on that? So can these help with mandatory breach notification? So I've sort of slipped a question in there, also with a statement. Up until now, previously, the only organisations that were obliged to notify anyone that there was a breach of data, and by the way, a breach of data doesn't just constitute data being stolen, it is misused, misappropriated, lost, corrupted, or an individual without the correct authority has accessed that data. You are obliged to undertake and notify A, the individuals, and 2, the Information Commissioner Officer or appropriate data protection authority. There is a time limit on when you need to contact the DPA, that is 72 hours. So start putting some strategies in place now on how you would do that, because if you became aware of a data breach, say 4 o'clock on a Friday, the clock's already clicking because it's from when you became aware of that data breach. And you don't always have to notify the individuals, but you do have to notify them, again, if the impact to them is high or likely to cause damage to them in terms of their freedoms, rights, or financial loss. So, why the data impact assessment is important? It allows you to start clarifying what processes and what type of data you would start thinking, okay, this has been breached, we now need to go into our breach notification plan and initiate that. So again, you can look at these things in isolation. If you take a more holistic approach, you'll probably start to find that it starts to hang together. What seems like a huge problem in terms of maybe trying to boil the ocean and getting compliant, if you can get the building blocks in place on each element, you have a plan, it's not too bad. It's quite achievable. Now, I want to spend a little bit of time on this in terms of who owns the risk. And really, it depends on which side of the fence you're sitting, I suppose. So if you are a data controller or a data processor, and I just want to clarify those terms, because in some circumstances, the data controller and data processor will be one and the same. However, we are now living in a world of outsourced capabilities where we see backup as a service, infrastructure as a service, software as a service, and those organizations that deal with that, which act on your instruction, are data processors. Data controller are those that collect the data, decide how that data is going to be used, and what's the outcome of that data. So let's look at the risk. And the risk is this. Previously, data processors have normally said, we are responsible for this information, and that is it. Under the regulation, the liability between the data processor and data controller become joint and several. So, what that means in real terms is, if your data processor has breached the regulation, misused the information, lost the information, and it has affected the individuals affected can either come to you as the data controller and bring litigation against you, or the Information Commissioner Officer can investigate you, and or the data processor. So there is no difference now in terms of a liability. Behind the scenes and contractually, absolutely you can start to look at that, but from a client-facing perspective, you are now one and the same in terms of a liability. So what is the contract worth? And what liability will I accept? So if you start thinking about all the data processors that you potentially may use, so if you are running a CRM and it is hosted in the cloud, that CRM now becomes a data processor. So it's not just perhaps what's obvious in terms of just our backup services or our infrastructure services, which we buy on demand from large cloud providers. It could well be that CRM system, that auditing, that perhaps HR system, perhaps the bookkeeping system. If that is cloud-based, they now fall into data processors. And if you are a data processor, if you are on that other side of the fence, and you have X amount of clients, start thinking about what is your risk appetite. Because I would imagine that if I was a data controller, I would be wanting to push that liability onto you. So start having a think about that. As a data controller, you are obliged to undertake mandatory due diligence. So that means you have to go and make sure that the data processor you have appointed is meeting the regulation and is not, a choice because they are, let's say, the cheapest, or you have your brother works there. You can't do that anymore. I'm not suggesting you are, but what you need to do is find out, go through that due diligence and make sure that they are, the correct data processor as per the regulation. And if you are a data processor, make sure you've got your answers ready. Make sure that you can effectively respond to these elements. And I just want to spend a little time, just a quick example of what I mean by, an increased liability. So let me just go through that very quickly. Let's say you've got a company turnover of 5 million, and you have a contract with a data processor worth 50,000. Probably up until now, you may have been looking at that risk as 50,000. If that contract goes wrong, there's underperformance, or the data processor doesn't meet the expectations, the top side of that liability is the contract value of 50,000, potentially. Moving forward, and we now see that fines are up to 4% of your previous year's global turnover, that contract now represents a potential liability for you as the controller of 200,000. And as the data processor, because you are now joint and severally liable, that's a 400% increase. Start multiplying that as a data processor across your business of how many clients you have. So what are the next steps? So as a data controller, calculate the upside liability. Look at your turnover, work out what the top side is, and that's, I'm not a mathematical genius by any stretch of the imagination. It's 4% of your previous year's global turnover, or probably this year's turnover when it comes in May next year. So that's your upside risk. And again, as I've said as a processor, start assessing your total increased financial risk. Identify who your data processors are. As I said, it might not be that obvious. And as a data processor, it's really Article 28 within the regulation that you need to adhere to. Because regardless of what you agree as a processor with the data controller, you now have freestanding obligations under the regulation. So go through Article 28, also Article 29 and 30 if you want to be specific, and make sure that you as a business, regardless of what you have agreed contractually, you have that in place, because that is your responsibility. As I've already said, as a controller, undertake due diligence and have your responses ready. And part of that due diligence should definitely be understanding that the processor at least has met the requirements under Article 28 and their new freestanding obligations. Will your data processor accept the new liabilities? Well, this is a question, isn't it? So, again, it's probably worth looking at where you stand now contractually with your data processors, assessing what that risk is contractually, and do you need to relook at those contracts? And again, as a data processor, start thinking about strategies that you can deploy in order to start mitigating that. So, how are you going to, are you going to accept that increased liability? Are you going to look at your liability insurance or cyber insurance in terms of will that cover you if you get multiple claims? So if you have a breach and it affects multiple businesses and all of them at 4% of their global turnover, the claims on you could start to really escalate. So how are you going to do that? Do your data processors understand how they can support your other obligations under the GDPR? So, within the regulation, within Articles 28, 29 and 30, as a data processor, you are actually obliged to help the data controller meet their own obligations. So if we look at Article 32 around, security, breach notification. So the controller has an obligation to notify, as I said earlier, the ICO within a certain period of time and the individuals. But the breach notification will almost certainly come from you if you are the processor of their data. So how are you as a data processor going to show that as a value add to your clients? And if you are you going to be able to do that at the same level of cost? So again, these are two sides of a fence. As the controller, you're going to be saying, you have an obligation to do this for me. You have freestanding and you are supposed to help me with my obligations. And as a processor, it's like, my commitment has gone up, that's going to have an impact on my bottom line. How am I going to deal with that? By the way, just a word to the controllers here, the data controllers, i.e. the businesses. You cannot abdicate all your responsibilities onto the processor. You cannot now turn around and go, thank you, Si, for pointing out Article 28 and the fact that they have to help us. It doesn't get you off that wonderful hook, which will become looming in by the end of the year. So, you still have your own obligations to meet. It's very much around the processor should be assisting you in that. But it's not assisting, is not taking away. So I think we're doing fairly well on time here. I just wanted to point out that don't forget sub-processors in your assessments. And this is for both controller and processor. Because you have to notify the controller, so I'm the processor, I have to notify the controller if I am using anyone else, i.e. AWS, Azure, or I'm using a CRM and their information might sit on that. So I have to say, this is who I'm using. Do I have your permission to use it? So again, start thinking about that, and in your assessment, start thinking about how you're going to deal with that. So hopefully I've put enough out there to get some questions.
We have several questions already. I'll just remind everybody if they want a burning question answered now, that'd be great to post it onto the webinar channel. I have several questions to start with from people. Sharp, thank you very much. It's very useful and always an eye opener. And sometimes when we have these kind of regulations sort of put upon businesses, it's always slightly annoying, but we have to work through it. One of the questions is around Brexit and how this affects it, as this is an EU regulation. So is there a mindset that it will change, or is it actually valid, or will it become mute?
Yeah, it's interesting actually. So there's a couple of reasons why Brexit will not affect the regulation that we need to comply with, and I'll just go through those. We will not be exiting by May 2018, and therefore we will need to comply by that date. Steve Wood from the ICO, who's a Chief International Strategist, has already said there will be no grace period, so there won't be a run-in on meeting the obligation. That's the date compliance need to be met, and if you haven't met it by that date, you might feel the wrath of a data protection authority. And two, the ICO have already stated that regardless of the status of the UK outside of the EU, once Brexit has come into force fully, they will be adhering to the regulation as it currently stands. And that makes perfect sense, because if we are not meeting the regulation, then we will not be able to transfer the flow of data freely to the European Union. So it's what's known as adequacy status, and countries like Guernsey, Isle of Man, Jersey have what is known as adequacy status, which means that as far as the European Union is concerned, the regulators, the law, and their adoption of the data privacy regulation is adequate enough where there doesn't need to be a specific framework or other mechanism for the transfer of that data, as we have in the US with Privacy Shield 2.0, and there are other mechanisms that you can use to transfer data outside of the EU.
That was one of the other questions regarding the grace period. So obviously that is something that people think, is there something that, is there a time frame in which once it enacts next year, will there be a period of time after that? And obviously, as you stated, the answer is no to that.
No.
Obviously, there's companies that I've got a few questions around marketing data, and I think, can you just clarify, I know we touched on it on some of the earlier slides, around if they've got a marketing database,
yeah,
what do they have to do? Do they have to delete it if they don't get a response? What should be the process?
Okay, so first thing to understand is if your processing of information relates to direct marketing, then you always need to obtain consent. So you might be using personal information that you've collected from an individual and may say, okay, I'm going to rely on legitimate interest in my business in order to process that data. But if you now want to use data you already have on your clients or new data to market to them, you always need consent. That's the first thing to bear in mind. And as I said, the standard for consent has increased. So you now need to go back to your database, to your client base that you have on direct marketing list and say, this is what we'd like to send you. This is the reason. And there's, specific areas where you need to, what you need to include in that consent notice, as I said, in order to be able to use it. If you don't get consent, if consent is not obtained, it is unlawful to process that data. Therefore, it needs to be deleted unless that data relates to another, you are processing that data in another manner, and you need to keep that data for a period of time, say under FCA regulation, 7 years or something like that. But if you, in terms of the data for marketing, if you haven't obtained consent, you can't use it, and I would suggest you delete it unless you need to keep it for another regulatory reason. One thing to bear in mind, and it's worth saying, inaction is not confirmation. So you cannot say, please tick this box if you don't want us to send you anything, or pre-tick boxes. It has to be by a clear, affirmative action and a statement. So they need to do something, and they need to understand what they are doing in order to obtain consent. Hopefully that sort of clears that up.
Thanks, Shop. One thing that's just come in is this just not another sort of cookie policy that we had a few years ago, where people had to click on the button to say that they acknowledged that there was a cookie involved?
Slightly different, and the reason why it's different is cookies and cookie policies are being looked at again, but they come under a slightly different regulation. So they come under what's known as the Privacy Electronic Communications Regulation, which is now also being reviewed and is turning into a harmonised EU regulation, again in May 2018, again administered through the data protection authorities, and again carrying fines of up to 4% is what we're seeing. So those tend to be around direct marketing. There is a feeling at the moment that we are suffering from what's known as cookie fatigue, where there are so many banners and tropes where you have to, click this, this is how we use cookies, this is the information we gather, etc., that the onus, this is the general feel, the onus for that will be put back onto the website browsers and those sort of providers of a service, the browsing service, so the individual will be able to control that through their settings. So it's, and the reason, so that's one thing, but the reason it is different is that this regulation, GDPR, is based in, going back from the human rights. So in the EU, General Data Protection Regulation is seen not just as a tick box exercise, it is seen as part of the fundamental freedoms and rights of individuals. And being honest with you, I think, if we look at regulations, they're normally 2-3 years, maybe more sometimes, behind what is being driven commercially and what citizens are looking for. Within the regulation, it talks about privacy by design and by default. Excuse me, and I think within a short period of time, we will see organisations that perhaps aren't really getting to grips with this and really saying, privacy runs through our business as a real thread, will be looked at by the consumers slightly differently. Recent survey put trust in organisations on how they use the data higher than customer service.
Thank you, Sharp. I've got probably the last one because I'm not conscious of time. If a customer testimonial is shared on social media, what do we do with that?
So, one, I would say you need to obtain consent that we are okay to do that. Two, I would make sure that you have that covered off in your fair processing notice. However, again, under the right to forget, you do have an obligation to delete that information if you've made it public. So, let me clarify because I might have muddied the water a little bit there. If you've made it clear within your fair processing notice or in your consent, whichever one you are relying on to share client content on your website, that this is what you are going to do and this is the potential impact to the individuals, and you can't necessarily be responsible for how that information is going to be disseminated and used once it's made public on your website, you've pretty much covered yourself in terms of liabilities for that. However, it does not abdicate you from the person saying, I now want you to take it down, you have to take it down.
Thank you. Well, thank you, everybody. We're sort of pushing this because it's very important for us to be compliant, but also we saw it that we could help our clients become compliant because, as Shab's pointed out, the liability is joint. So we wanted to minimise our own risks, and by helping our clients, we can do that. Part of our offering, people that have been on the webinar today, thank you very much for your time. We'd like to offer you a 10% discount if you mention the webinar. Then by all means we'll put that onto any of our GDPR services, and that they will be around, reviewing questions for suppliers